Welcome to the first of 4 sessions on the evolution of American society. I'd like to first go through our introductory hypotheses. The American economy has extraordinary resources, and its entrepreneurship has made it a strong economy with ample room to grow. Our aging population has impacted economic growth, healthcare costs, and government deficits, as well as the livable environment. And that will become a more and more important issue as we go forward. Women are playing an ever more important role in the workforce and in generating family income, yet they still do not enjoy equal compensation. Immigration is crucial to our long-term economic growth. And while the American economy has made advances and lives have improved, there are still many inequalities within American society. The great differentiator in wealth in the United States is not wages, but rather returns on financial investments. And financial engineering is also a very important factor in corporate success. The links that keep society together are fraying, and young people in particular feel isolated. There is less domestic mobility movement within the United States today, and as a result of that, fewer people are exposed to new or different ideas, and there is greater misunderstanding between different parts of the country and different segments of the population. Rural America, in particular, is losing its links with the rest of the country. And our sources of news and the way the news is delivered have changed radically. And the consensus that was more common in the 1950s and 60s has disappeared. Our first topic will be the demographics of America. Here is a cover from the Saturday Evening Post of April 1961, reflecting the diversity of population in the United States. I used to read the Saturday Evening Post every week when it came in. America's population in 1950 was 158 million people. By 2010, it had doubled to 312 million people. And in 2019, it was 328 million people. The composition of the population has changed dramatically. In 1965, about 83% of the population was Caucasian, 12 to 13% was African American, and about 5%, 8% were Hispanic. By 2015, the percentage of Caucasians had fallen to about 65%. The proportion of African Americans remained relatively steady, and the Hispanic population increased significantly to almost 25% of the population. Immigration, the foreign-born population of the United States, was at its highest point 1910 and 1920, with 14.7% of the population and about 14 million people. There was a steady decline until 1965, 1970, when the new Nationality Act was passed by Congress, which eliminated country quotas for immigrant visas and emphasized the reuniting of immigrant families and encouraging skilled professionals to immigrate to the United States. From that point onward, the number of immigrants grew from below 10 million to 44.5 million in 2017, about 13.7% of the population. The largest number of immigrants coming in during that period came from Latin America, East and South Asia, and also increasing numbers coming from Africa. The aging of the population is shown here in this chart. You can see when the baby boomers, the generation born immediately after World War II up until 1965, has turned 65, and there has been a great increase in the number of seniors in the United States. And that trend will get steeper going forward. You can see here in this population pyramid, which divides males on the left and females on the right by 5-year age increments, that there was a big bulge in the early 50s as soldiers came back from World War II and established their families or reunited with their wives and added more children to the population. So about 11% of the population in 1950 was age 4 or younger. By 2019, that generation had flowed through the pyramid, and you can see that the ages 64 and above show slight declines, but there's no large bulge that comes behind that. And in fact, the lower part of the pyramid is narrower. If we carry it forward to 2050, you can see that the young people in the United States are an increasingly smaller portion of the overall population. And this is a result of a declining fertility ratio. You can see in this graph that the fertility ratio increased after World War II and reached a peak around 1960. And then from that point it fell, although it is bumped around between approximately 1.6 and 2. But it requires a fertility ratio of 2.1 to maintain a constant population. And so for much of the last 50 years, the United States has been operating below or just barely meeting the stable population fertility ratio. As births have fallen, and here the upper part of the graph is net births, meaning live births less deaths, which range from a high of 1.9 million in 2006, and then fell to below 1 million by 2018, has been partially offset by the number of immigrants coming to the United States. America's workforce from the 1950s onward continuously grew, but now it has stagnated. And as a result of that, we see the dependency ratio, which is the number of youth and seniors who are not engaged in the workforce, as a ratio of the employment level has fallen from a 65 to 67% of the population being comprised of the workforce in 1960, down to about 52.5% in 2015. That means that there are fewer people who are contributing to economic growth as a percentage of the total population, And it also means that there are more expenditures used to support the retired population. If we take a look at a map of the United States broken down by county, you can see that the purplish colors are counties which have seen a decline in the working age population of between 5 and 10%. And most counties in the United States have seen that kind of decline. The yellowish and brown colors are counties which have seen an increase in their population. And you notice that that's in areas like Southern California, the Seattle area, Texas, and Florida. This map shows the states which have seen the number of people moving into the state exceeding the number of people moving out in the darker colors. And those states in the lighter colors where more people have moved to other states in the Union and less people have moved in. And you can see in the case of California, there were 43.1% of the total moves coming into California. That means there were more people leaving California than moving into California, although that's offset by the number of births. When we take a look at the cities in America, in 1940, the top 10 cities in the United States were New York, Chicago, Philadelphia, Detroit, and Los Angeles, followed by Cleveland, Baltimore, St. Louis, Boston, and Pittsburgh. By 2010, New York was still the largest city in the United States. Los Angeles had climbed to number 2. Chicago had fallen to number 3. Philadelphia remained within the top 10, but there are 6 new cities in that top 10. Phoenix was the fastest growing city in 2019. San Antonio was number 2. When you take a look at San Antonio, San Diego, Dallas, San Jose, Phoenix, and Los Angeles, one characteristic is that they all have major high technology industries operating in them. That is creating jobs and that is creating population growth. Most counties in the United States are rural. So between the Sierra Nevadas and the Cascade Mountains in the Northwest, almost to the Mississippi, the vast majority of counties are rural counties. Our next section is health. And as we start off here, on the left-hand side, you will see the cast of Marcus Welby, MD, Robert Young playing Marcus Welby. At the end of our presentation today, in our discussion when that takes place, you will be asked to name his young assistant, pictured on the left, who is married to Barbara Streisand. On the right-hand side, we have the Marlboro Man. The Marlboro Man was one of the most famous advertising logos in the United States during the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And the question that you'll have to answer here is, what was the distinguishing characteristic of the Marlboro Man? People in the United States are enjoying higher and higher life expectancy. In 1950, women's life expectancy was 72 years of age, and that has now reached in 2017 about 83 years, and men went from 67 to 80 years of age. In 2019, life expectancy was 78.9 years. This difference in the life expectancy is also reflected in the mortality rates among women and men. Women have a women have a lower mortality rate than men, as shown here in the black line. And that gap has remained quite consistent. But ethnicity is a factor in mortality. And while the mortality rates have fallen for all ethnic groups, you can see that the Hispanic population has the lowest mortality rate, and their advantage has increased. Whites have seen a decline in the mortality rate, and African Americans have seen a very significant fall in mortality rates, but it's still about 20% higher than for whites. 10 states in the United States have the lowest mortality rates. You can see here in the light color, and California is one of those states. As we go through this section, you're going to see that California compares very favorably with the United States, and we will try and explain some of the factors behind that. In the 1900s, epidemic diseases were the major cause of death. You can see here pneumonia, tuberculosis, diarrhea, and enteritis were the top three. Heart disease, stroke, and liver were the next three. And diphtheria was there at the bottom. But by the 2016-2017, heart disease and cancer were far and away the greatest contributor to deaths in the United States. And influenza and pneumonia were ranked number 7. In fact, 46% of deaths in 1910 were from infectious diseases, and that had fallen to 3% in 2010. Now, this is ironic in the current environment, but you can see that there was a dramatic fall in the normal pneumonia and flu. Now, there are some confusing statistics on the flu. Over the period 2010 to 2019, flu deaths were about 36,000 per year. But in the 2017-2018 flu season, the number of people who died were approximately 80,000, and 45 million fell ill. Now, what's confusing here is there is a flu season that runs from the middle of the year to the middle of the next year, and then there's a calendar year, and those often get confused. A major factor in the flu problems are that only 50% of Americans get flu shots, and every year the flu is changing. Measles was a major problem in the 50s, but the advances in vaccinations against measles were very effective, and measles effectively disappeared from the United States. However, as a result of a British medical researcher who completely fabricated a report claiming to show a link between vaccinations and autism, more and more families chose not to get the measles vaccination and other such vaccinations. And when carriers from other countries arrived in the United States to visit tourist sites, there were severe measles outbreaks. In 2019, there was a major measles outbreak in New York. Polio is an American success story where medical science came and changed the entire game. You can see that going up to 1955, in the 8 or 10 years prior to that, the number of cases represented in yellow, orange, and red increased dramatically. This is shown state by state. In 1955, Dr. Salk introduced the polio vaccine. He's shown in the left-hand photograph injecting the vaccine in a child. Only 2 years later, Dr. Sabin developed an oral vaccine and began a series of Sabin Sundays in communities across the United States, as pictured on the right-hand side. I can remember in my community, we all went to the elementary school to take the oral vaccine, which was put on a sugar cube and made it easy to swallow. Prior to that, there were, in our community, 2 high school football players who came down with polio. And it was a very worrisome, scary situation. Another major breakthrough in medicine was the development of organ transplants. And between 1988 and 2019, in that 30-year period, there were 455,000 kidney transplants, 168,000 liver transplants, and 74,000 heart transplants. In this photo on the left-hand side, you can see Dr. Christian Bernard, a South African physician who was the first person to carry out a successful heart transplant. Dr. DeBakey, the gentleman in the middle who practiced at Baylor Medical Center in Texas, was the first American physician to carry out a heart transplant, and he had many successful operations thereafter. He was also the developer of heart bypass technology, which has saved many, many lives in the United States and elsewhere. Diabetes has become a serious problem in the United States. It is estimated that there are 100 million diabetic or pre-diabetic people in the United States. You can see how it increased between 1994 and 2015. American Indians have the highest incidence of diabetes at 15% of the population, African Americans 13%, Hispanics 12%, and whites 7%. Asthma is a stubbornly persistent condition in the United States with about 8% of the population. But again, when we take a look at the situation across the United States, there are 5 states and the District of Columbia which have the lowest incidence of asthma. California is one of those states. One surprising thing about health in America is the incidence of maternal deaths which take place during childbirth or the first year after the child is born, related to the birth process. And while the rate of maternal deaths worldwide declined by 45% between 1990 and 2013, and even in developing countries it fell by 47%, in the United States, although it's much lower than some areas, it rose by 136%. Now, one of the factors in this is that, as we will see later, women in the United States are giving birth at an older age, where the risks that are related to the birth process are higher. Now, the total number of deaths is only 700 in the United States, but it is really terrible tragedy that any of these 700 are passing away. Again, California shows a better record than the United States with a maternal mortality rate at between 6 and 7 compared to 22 for the country at large. There have been dramatic changes in the way that cancer is treated, and they have generated considerable success. The process now is to study the DNA of the cancer of the specific individual and then create a chemotherapy formula that specifically attacks that DNA. So the cancer death rate among men reached a high in 1990 of 280 per 100,000 people. Cancer death rate among women in 1991 was only 175. Women's death rate has continued to fall, but men's death rate fell dramatically. And I think part of that is related to the issue of smoking, which we will get to momentarily. But here you take a look at cancer incidence across the United States, county by county. And you can see there is a concentration in the area that is roughly between Ohio and Louisiana, Oklahoma. Now, part of this roughly coincides with the Appalachian part of the United States. But as we go through our presentations over these 4 sessions, you will see that this particular area of the United States is affected by a number of negative factors and something that deserves review. It is surprising to note that there are in Northern California, Oregon, and parts of Washington relatively high incidence of cancer. If we take a look at lung cancer in particular, again, there are 4 states and the District of Columbia which have the lowest level of lung cancer. And this coincides with the fact that California is one of those states, and California was the first state to outlaw cigarette smoking in restaurants in 2002. By 2012, another 34 states also implemented a ban on smoking in restaurants. And you can see that there are many other cities in the other states which have banned that. There have been dramatic breakthroughs in reducing smoking in the United States after the Surgeon General announced in 1964 that there was a direct connection between smoking and lung cancer. So the number of cigarettes in 1980 sold in the United States was 628. It fell by more than 60% in 2018 to 217 billion cigarettes. And we see also during that period a dramatic decline in the amount of smoking by teenagers. The blue triangles are 12th graders, the green triangles are 10th graders, and the red triangles are 8th graders. And you can see they fell very significantly during that period. However, a new scourge has appeared. This chart shows the sales of vaping products in the United States by different manufacturer. And in the first quarter of 2011, those sales totaled less than $50 million. But by 2017, they had reached $400 million and have continued to climb. And as a result of this, the smoking that is occurring among teenagers has, including vaping, has gone back up again, as represented in the black dotted line, dashed line, as well as the overall tobacco and e-cigarette smoking that is shown in the black line. So this is a really unfortunate development. Other addictions have also seen increases. In 1999, there were about 7,000 deaths from alcohol per 100,000 people, and that increased by about 50% over the ensuing 18 years. Suicides increased by 40% during that period, but drug deaths tripled between 1999 and 2017. And major reason behind this is the abuse of synthetic opioids. Here you can see the drug overdose deaths in the United States between 1990 and 2018. And they reached 75,000 in 2018, of which 75% were the opiates, as opposed to heroin and other such drug deaths. So at one point, there were 130 people dying every day from opioid abuse. Now, suicides have hit rural America hardest. If you look at the county map in the left-hand side, you see the darker colors are the highest rates of suicides. And if you turn back to the map we showed earlier about the rural areas of the United States, it really coincides with this map. On the right-hand side, we get a little bit more specific. So the level of the suicide rate in non-towns and tiny towns is about 20 per 100,000. For large cities, it is almost 50% lower, between 11 and 12. Obesity has also emerged as a health issue in the United States. 42% of adults and 17% of youth are obese in the United States. And you can see in the lower map that the obesity is really concentrated in the Midwest, the Southeast, and the Atlantic seaboard, except for New York, Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, Vermont, and New Hampshire. It's not helped by diet. And so you can see that the size of meals in 1950 at restaurants has tripled by 2012. And in the case of soda, it's increased by 6 times. It's also not helped by the fact that Americans in general do not follow dietary guidelines. They eat more than is recommended of meat, eggs, and nuts, and a little bit more of grains, but they eat significantly less than the dietary guidelines for vegetables, dairy, and fruit. Americans also live under a great deal of stress, and the survey taken shows that mass shootings, healthcare, work, current political climate, and money are all things that wear on the people. But in the area of work, the major forms of stress come as a result of low salaries, lack of opportunity for advancement, and heavy workload. The United States has the highest level of healthcare spending in the world, at about 17.5% of GDP. This is the best way to compare different countries rather than just in dollar amounts given population differences. And healthcare costs have been increasing dramatically. So in 1988, there were the healthcare costs borne by Medicare, Medicaid, and public hospitals was approximately $200 billion. And that rose to $1.6 trillion by 2018. The private costs, the out-of-pocket costs for individuals and their healthcare insurance premiums rose from 380 billion to $2 trillion. Healthcare premiums have increased much faster than the overall inflationary figures in the United States. Between 2000 and 2010, overall inflation was about 27%. The healthcare premiums rose by 114% over that same period, and the workers' contribution to those premiums rose by 147%. As we dig into this deeper, we find that the portion of healthcare insurance premiums paid by individuals has gone up from about $2,500 in 1999 to almost $6,000 in 2019. However, employers have seen their contribution on average increase by from about $6,000 in 1999 to $13,000 in 2019. So they're bearing a very high burden on this, and this is particularly a problem for small businesses. Prescription drug spending has soared. It began in the 1990s, and it has reached a level of about $1,000 per year. If we look at the rest of the world, you can see the $1,000 figure for 2015. The next highest is Switzerland at about $790 per year. So in this aspect of healthcare spending, we also have the highest level in the world. Now, before the introduction of Medicare under President Lyndon Johnson, it was very difficult for people above the age of 65 to obtain medical insurance. With the introduction of Medicare and Medicaid, you can see a dramatic decline in the number of people who were not covered by insurance between 1964 and 1974. There has been between that period and 2012, there was a upward slope in the number of people who were uninsured. But the introduction of the Affordable Care Act again dramatically reduced the number of people who are not covered by health insurance. Medicare spending, following the introduction in the 1960s, has seen a steady increase, and it's become a faster increase as our population has aged. So in 2020, both hospital insurance and physicians' charges and other services have gone up. And we will come back to this because in terms of Medicaid, there are different ways that this will weigh on America in coming years. The Medicare Trust Fund is being overwhelmed by the number of people who now are signed up for Medicare. Number two, that they're older and living longer, and that they are receiving more types of medical services as medicine has made scientific advances. So this looks very fearsome as this goes forward, and at some point there's going to have to be a way of addressing this. But we should not overreact to this. In the year 2026, it is estimated that the Medicare fund will cover 89% of the hospital insurance cost, but it will still be able to cover all of the doctor's fees and the outpatient costs that occur. It's still a major issue, but Medicare is not going to just stop in 2026. Our next topic is households. And some of you will remember S&H green stamps that you used to receive when you did your grocery shopping. You put them in a little book, and when you filled up a book or more books, then you could turn them in for merchandise from S&H. The Atlantic and Pacific grocery chain, which started in the 1850s, and in 1965, it was the largest retailer of any type in the United States. It was still the largest grocery retailer in 1975, went out of business in 2015. Their business model did not take into account changes in competition from companies like Whole Foods. They focused too much on trying to reduce their cost of supplies of items from vendors, and didn't focus on the desires of their customers. So a firm like Whole Foods, which talks about high quality food and healthy food, became a very tough competitor. Now, since the 1980s, there have been a constant increase, with the exception of a short period just after the turn of the century, in the number of households formed in the United States. That is, people getting married and having children. But you can see that it has been very erratic. And to give you a sort of a early warning, part of this is going to be related to the cost of living. Part of this is going to be related to social changes. The number of people living in the households declined steadily from the 19th century onward. In 1850, the average size of a family was 5.5 people per household. By 2003, it was 2.5 people per household, and there was a slight uptick after that. What has changed dramatically is that the percentage of single-person households in the United States went from 12.5% in 1960 to 27.5% in 2018. These are people who delayed marriage, never got married. They have longer life expectancy, and so they've made the choice to live alone. Another major change has been the number of stay-home dads, men who were staying at home and being the housekeeper. There were 1 million in 1989. By 2012, it was 2 million. The number of men who are now caring for the family, the motivation is to care for the family, has gone from 5% to 21%. Part of this is a result of being unable to find work, men who lost their jobs in the Great Recession and haven't been able to get it back, and the wife has, in that case, been able to find a job. Those are two changes. When we look at households, we find that 63% of households, both the mother and father work. In 46% of the households, both the mother and father work full-time. In 17%, the dad works full-time and the mother works part-time. 26%, the mother is not employed. And then in 6%, the husband is a stay-at-home person and the wife is the breadwinner. People take on multiple jobs. And so between 2000 and 2008, they ranged from 7 million to 8 million people holding multiple jobs. in the wake of the Great Recession and the rise in unemployment, the number fell down to about 6,500, but it's back up to 8,500. And again, we've talked about cost of living, and we'll see the factors in this. This is a major reason for people holding down multiple jobs. Women's contribution to family income has increased from about 27% in the 1970s to almost 40% in recent years. And middle class income has grown. So this is the median household income in the United States. 50% earn less than this, 50% earn more than this. And it rose from 51,000 in 1980 to 63,000 in 2019. But there is a wide variation in this based on ethnicity. Black families have seen an increase in their income, but it only reached 41,000 in 2018. Hispanics, 51,000. Population as a whole, we saw 63,000. Caucasian families had a family income of almost 71,000, and Asians had a family income of 87,000. But when we take a look at the highest level of income and the lowest level, there is a really wide differentiation. So the bottom 20% of families in terms of income have seen virtually no change in their income between 1980 and 2017. We saw that the median income rose to $63,000. That's the red line in this graph. The blue-green line is the top 20% of Americans, and their median income is over $200,000. But the median income of the top 5% of families in the United States is close to $400,000 per year. That's a huge gap between the lowest 20% and the top 5%. Now, the number of people living in poverty declined between 1964 and 1974. Lyndon Johnson introduced the Great Society in his inauguration speech in 1964. And so you saw an important decline in poverty during that period of time. Since then, it rose until about 1992, and then it fell again. But then after the Great Recession, it rose to 46 million people in 2014, almost 47 million people. In 2019, that had fallen to 42 million people. Now, the American family spends most of their money. Their biggest expense is housing. Second largest expense is transportation. The third is food, followed by clothing, health care, and recreation and entertainment. You can see that housing costs have gone up, and we will talk about that in more detail. Transportation went up, and then it has fallen slightly. And food, as you can see here, food taken that is eating out has been relatively stable between the relatively low inflationary pressures on that and people being more selective in eating out. They've managed to keep their food prices down. Energy costs have come down with the price of oil and gasoline, and that's benefited families. But three expenditures have really pressured income. In the last 30 years, household income has increased by about 130%. During that same period, housing prices went up by 180%. Healthcare expenditures, out-of-pocket expenditures, including health insurance costs, went up by 270%, and college tuition went up by almost 550% during that period. Now, there was a lot of borrowing in the 1980s. Most of these financial obligations are residential mortgages, but they include credit card and car financing. Fell, and then during the housing boom, between the late 1990s and 2008, there was again a significant increase in household debt. But with the bursting of the housing bubble, first through repossessions of houses and the wiping out of those loans, and then very strict financial discipline exercised by American families, the amount of debt came down significantly. But wealth, like income, has great inequalities in the United States. The bottom 50% of American families have financial assets, wealth, financial assets and housing value, which is less than $2 trillion out of a total of $125 trillion in family assets in the United States. The next 40%, that is from 51 to 90%, have about $25 trillion. Those, the families who have the next 10% of wealth control close to $50 trillion, and then the top 1% have wealth that is equal to about $30 trillion. Now, there is a dramatic difference in the assets of these different segments of the population. And here you can see on the right-hand side that the bottom 90% of families own about 60% of the housing in the United States. So this 90% of the families, which obviously is a much, much bigger number than the other 10%, have the bulk of their assets in the house. The top 10% own about 40% of housing by value. But when we take a look at stocks, the top 10% own about 80% of stocks. And why is this important? Because when we take a look at what has taken place over the last 10 years, on the left-hand side, you can see what are referred to as real economy prices. During the 10 years, U.S. wages went up over that 10-year period by a cumulative 50%. Housing prices recovered from the bubble burst, and they went up by about 47%. Overall inflation, consumer price index, went up by about 20% during that period. But when we look at assets, we can see that the S&P 500, the stock market, went up by 350%. The bond market went up by between 150 and 200%. So the wealthy families, which own 85% of the stocks, watch those assets increase in value by 85%. Passive increase in their wealth. We talked about mobility in the United States, and here you can see again the county map, and the dark colors, the blue colors, are counties in which 75 to 90% of the population were born in the same state they are currently living in. So if they've moved at all, they haven't moved very far, and many of them have not moved. Those in the greenish colors were about 10 to 40% were born in the state in which they currently live. Another aspect about families is the way they connect with the rest of the world, and some of you will remember the concept of a party line. When we moved into our home, I was about 2 or 3 years old in the Bay Area. We had a party line we shared with 2 other families. You can see that since the 1940s, the number of households which have telephones has climbed from less than 50% to almost 98%. And when we take a look at TVs, there's also been a change. We did not have a TV until I was about 8 years old. My 2 brothers and I used to go next door to watch Howdy Doody at a neighbor's house. In 1975, 57% of households had 1 television set, 32% had 2 sets, and 11% had 3 sets. By 2010, 55% of families had 3 television sets. Now, today, if you want to really talk about viewing TV, it may be 6 or 7 between desktop computers, iPhones, and iPads in which you can watch TV separately from your TV sets themselves. Surprising fact is that the number of trips taken by people, automobile trips, after reaching about 2,300 per year in 1995, has fallen to about 1,800. Obviously, this includes running shopping errands, going to work, and also taking holidays. But I did not expect to see this. What really stunned me, though, was that the number of 16-year-olds who hold a driver's license has fallen dramatically. When I was in junior high school and high school, turning 16 meant a degree of freedom, that you had a driver's license, and if you were lucky, you were going to be able to go out with your friends. And most important of all, when you went out on a date, you didn't have your father driving you and making corny jokes which embarrassed you in front of your date. 46% of 16-year-olds had driver's licenses in 1984. It fell below 25% by 2014. Now, one factor behind this is the emergence of ride-hailing, where you can make a phone call and somebody will come up, pick you up right wherever you are, and take you wherever you want to go. So if we take a look at taxi trips, in 2012, the number of taxi trips was about 1.3 billion. And there were an infinitesimal number of ride-hailing. By 2018, the number of taxi trips had fallen to about 700 million. And the number of Uber rides and Lyft had reached about 3.5 billion. Now, there are other important factors about family. First, most people sleep on their side, and the baby boomer generation, those born between the end of World War II and 1965, are the leaders in that area. Very few people sleep on their back. And the younger people in the world, a quarter of them sleep on their stomach. At my age, it's impossible to sleep on my stomach because I would be getting seasick. If you're a pepperoni lover, you are one of the top pizza eaters in the country. If you are an anchovy lover, you're really in the minority. And 55% of Americans like creamy peanut butter, 31% like crunchy peanut butter, 10% don't eat peanut butter, and they may be omitted from the 2020 census because they don't eat peanut butter. We're going to conclude today with a section on housing. Here you can see a house under construction. This is not what you see very often in some parts of the country where the weather is more severe. At the end of World War II, all of these members of the Great Generation came back and they wanted to start their life. They were looking forward to having a home and starting a family. And so in Daly City, you had these tract houses. And these large tracts were found all in many parts of the United States. Eichler homes were very popular in Northern California, in the San Francisco Bay Area and Los Angeles area, and open design, very airy. But if you go to the East Coast, you will find that public housing is usually high blocks, often made with a brick exterior. Now, home ownership has risen and fallen over the last 60 years. It was about 63% of families owned houses in 1965. It rose to about 65.5% in 1980. It fell slightly, and then during the housing boom, it got as high as 69%. Part of this is a result of the development, the expansion of the mortgage industry and making it more possible. Part of it was an effort by Congress to promote home ownership. The fall after 2008 is partially attributable to the fact that there were 7.8 million foreclosures on houses, families losing their home during the Great Recession. But as we look at housing construction over the years, and this goes all the way back to the turn of the 20th century, it has been very erratic. There have been high peaks and then dramatic falls. The highest peak was in 1972 when there were over 11,000 new houses constructed per million people in the population. And it fell and it had a dramatic drop after the burst of the housing market in 2008. The number of new houses sold per month was its highest in the period from 2000 to 2009. 900,000 new houses sold every month in the United States. But if we take a look at construction in California, the orange bar portion of the bar is single-family housing. The blue portion of the bar is multifamily housing. And you can see that it's been very erratic and it's fallen off dramatically. If you look at the right-hand side of this graph, there's a black line which indicates the number of new units that have to be built to meet the demand. And it's far below that. That helps explain price pressure in the United States and the fact that there are fewer people owning houses. Now, the problem with this is that when there are insufficient number of new homes, single-family homes, that increases demand for apartments. And when you increase the demand for apartments from people who would like to buy a home and can afford to, but can't find one, you're putting low-income families out of the apartment market. If we look at the cost of housing and the number of new houses coming on the market, you can see that starter houses that cost less than $150,000 represented 30% of the market in 2002, and it's fallen to about 2% of the market in 2019. This is really the egregious effect of this housing boom and the sharp rise in prices and people trying to outbid people for prices. The biggest segment of the market now is houses between 200,000 and 299,000. That represents almost 60% of the market. It held only 35%, 40% back in 2002. And you can see the most expensive houses, over 400,000, has become the second largest segment of the market. And homes are getting larger. That's obviously, there's a direct relationship between cost and size. And here you can see that the biggest portion of the market, which is almost 30% of the market, is between 1,800 and 2,400 square feet. And those that are over 4,000 square feet have grown to be almost 10% of the market. There are an increasing number of rental apartments. These are multifamily units which were completed during a particular year. The olive-colored line is built for sale, that is condominiums. And there was a brief burst of interest in condominiums in the middle of the first decade, and it's fallen off dramatically. But those built for rent have increased from 200,000 to more than 300,000 in 2018. Now, this is buildings with 10 or more units. There are 44 million renters in the United States. Half of those renters pay more than 30% of their income, which is generally the maximum that is recommended for servicing your housing costs. And another factor that's going on in the rental market is more of the rentals are high class rentals. A quarter of renters, 11 million renters, earn more than $75,000 a year and therefore can afford these luxurious apartments. And if we take a look at the age of houses in the United States, the housing stock overall, the blue color are houses that were built in 1939 or earlier. And you can see they dominate in New England and in the upper Midwest. And the problem here is that these houses have higher fire risk, and there's a higher cost of heating them. They're not built to the same insulation standards that newer housing are. We lived in the Boston area for a few years, and frequently there were reports in the newspaper of fires that were fatal or put people out of their homes. And the housing market has grown with the mortgage market and the various kinds of mortgage products which were introduced to entice people into buying. So that mortgage market is now worth $10.3 trillion. And that concludes today's session. Thank you very much.